Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, or morning. Actually, it's evening right now. Um, I just finished seeing that the other YouTube video finally was loaded up, so you guys have been able to see that. And what I'm going to do with this one is actually um, continue on with the notes from World War II. So what I'd like you to have is your notes out in front of you. And if you flip over to page 2, this is going to be, we're going to go to the World War II and the Americas, paper 3, United States, Neighbors, and World War II. And we'll go through all those bullet points. And then probably on the next video, which will be the last video for this unit, then we'll go back up to the top of page 2, the effects and results of the war, a lot of the things after World War II. And there will actually be a lot of overlap between that and folding into our next unit, which is the beginning part of the Cold War. So let's go ahead and have your notes ready to go for, let me get mine ready to go here. Yeah, there we go. Okay, I'm getting slightly better at this. Oh my gosh, technology. Let's see, here we go. This is what I want to have up there, right there, and I'll be up in the corner, and you guys can look at the PowerPoint as though you were in my classroom. So this is the first bullet point. We're talking about the concept of his hemispheric relationships, hemispheric reactions to the events in Europe, inter-America diplomacy, cooperation, neutrality, Franklin D. Roosevelt's good neighbor policy during World War II. Okay, so what we've got here is we're looking at the Americas. What's going on in the Americas? Obviously, World War II is impacting everywhere, but this particular paper 3 topic focuses on the Americas. So what is going on in the Americas? Well, the biggest country in the Americas is the United States of America. And what was our position at the beginning part of World War II? We were neutral. We wanted to stay out of it. One country obviously got into the war very, very quickly, Canada, and we'll talk about Canada here in a moment. Yes, we're going to be talking about Canada. And they got into the war very, very soon after Britain did. But the United States delayed quite a bit. And we've talked about the United States position relative to the war with the Lend-Lease Act, and we ultimately ended up favoring the Allied side. Couldn't really trade with the Axis side, even if we wanted to, because thanks to the British Navy blocking a lot of the transatlantic trade that would have ultimately gone to Italy or to Germany. So an interesting thing going on here is the United States relationship to Latin American countries, Mexico, Brazil, et cetera, et cetera. We didn't really want them to get too involved in the war either. Remember the good neighbor policy prior to World War II, where President Roosevelt was saying, hey, we're going to be a different United States of America. We're not going to boss you around and tell you what to do and be your Uncle Sam and tell you have to stay 6 feet apart and da-da-da, you can't touch this and can't touch that. And anyway, so that changes a little bit during World War II. We, especially as we get closer to actually going into the war itself, when we do go into the war itself, we are not very interested in any Latin American country taking the side of the Axis. And there were some that might have possibly gone into the side of the Axis, but no, we certainly discouraged them. The fact that they couldn't trade with Germany was a real discouragement to them. They were trying to come out of the Depression as was the United States, and their trade opportunities actually existed trading to allied countries, to the British. And of course, then the Germans, using U-boats, were trying to sink as many as those ships from Mexico, from Brazil, from Argentina, and so forth, as they crossed the Atlantic to provide and sell supplies to the British. And that would continue on after the United States got into the war as well. Although probably Chile and Argentina, write those two countries down, Chile and Argentina, they had some sympathies toward Germany, in part because of a lot of German immigrants that had moved there in the previous years. And so there was some sentiments there as well. And some of the countries actually had some sort of like semi-fascist regimes. Didn't necessarily mean that they were going to support fascist regimes like Italy and Germany, but nevertheless, some of their governments had some resemblance to that. Let's see. Yeah, and a couple of things I wanted to mention as well. Once the United States got into the war, there will be quite a few other countries from Latin America that will, including many from Central America, Mexico, and Central American countries. And from that point on, it'll really help bring those countries out of the depression, because the United States is going to be buying all kinds of supplies and resources for the war effort. Okay. Yes, let's move on. Okay. Next one, looking at Canada. So let me see, double checking here. Yep, bullet point number 4, Canada. We're going to talk about Canada in World War II, just like we talked about Canada World War I. Canada is going to be playing a very critical role. There's your Prime Minister on the Canadian banknote, and Mackenzie King, and they're going to be involved in the war pretty much from the get-go. They had been a fully sovereign, co-equal part of the British Commonwealth since 1931, so they could actually make their own foreign policy decisions, as opposed to World War I, when the British automatically declared on behalf of Canada war against Germany. This time, Canada declared war on September 10, 1939, which is like, what, about a week or so after Britain declared war on Germany, after Germany attacked Poland. And of course, they're going to be sending over all kinds of soldiers and airmen, and their Navy is going to be very involved in making sure, as much as it could, that ships could cross the Atlantic Ocean. There were even some Americans that wanted to fight in the war before we officially got into it. And so we joined, some of those Americans joined the Canadian military or the British military to go into the fight. Let's say a couple other things. Oh, let's talk about this one. When the United States got into the war, our cooperation with Canada really went up. And we were doing all kinds of various different things to help each other. We were operating air bases on Newfoundland, which is over on the East Coast. And then West Coast, you can see right here, the Alaska Highway, major construction project was instituted and completed during World War II to connect the United States, western states right here, Idaho, Montana, and so forth, through Canada and up to Alaska for strategic purposes. This was put together, major accomplishment there, so that we could have the United States linked, and of course all these Canadians resources and so forth can make its way to Alaska harbors and so forth, because we did actually have, way out here in the Aleutian Islands, there was US naval activity. And in fact, even the Japanese took one or two of our Aleutian Islands for a brief period of time during World War II. So that was a big thing that was accomplished there. Let's see. Let's hold off on that one for a moment. Talk about a couple of other issues. Details. 1.1 million Canadians served in the military. 1.1 million. 90,000 casualties, of which half of those were Canadian dead in the war effort. 41% of all Canadian males who were draft eligible ended up serving in the Canadian military. Although it's interesting to point out, just like in World War I, there was one province where they weren't quite as excited about going into the war effort, and that was Quebec, where only 25% of eligible men ended up serving in the Canadian military. The Canadian ships helped in providing support for the Atlantic convoys, coordinated with the Royal Air Force, the RAF. By 1945, the Canadian Navy was the third largest in the world. They helped to sink 52 German U-boats, although in the process lost 59 merchant ships and 24 other warships in that effort in the Atlantic. I wanted to point out D-Day. Canada was a participant in D-Day. the massive invasion, June 6, 1944, where the Allies were able to open up a Western front to put a lot of pressure on the Germans. This was in Normandy in northern France, and massive effort coordinated by the British, the Canadian, and American forces under the leadership of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was the overall commander. The United States beaches were Utah and Omaha, and the British and Canadian beaches were Gold, Juno, and Sword, and they each landed against heavy German fortifications, and all of the beaches were successful ultimately, even at high cost of lives. Beachheads were established so that heavy equipment could be brought in, and then they ultimately, the British, Americans, and Canadians were able to break out of those areas, see the green lines here, and take control back over of northern France, and then push on toward Germany itself, helping to end the war by the next year, even within a year, when the Germans surrendered on VE Day in 1945. But here's an interesting one. Let's see if you can figure this one out. We got Gold, Juno, and Sword. 2 of the 3 are British, and 1 is the Canadian beach, so named. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division landed on Juno. There you go. Yeah, Juno was the beach the Canadians landed on. The 3rd Infantry, excuse me, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. So major success and effort and participation by the Canadian military in World War II. Okay, and that's for you questions. And seriously, if you do have questions, do send those along to me. I'm going to make sure that you guys are very clear. Sometimes if I'm talking too fast, there's a solution. Hit pause, rewind, play back. Okay, all right, here we go. Next, let's move on to the Mexican situation. Again, for the history of the Americas, I've chosen 3 countries, Canada, Mexico, and Brazil, to focus on as we go through history and look and compare those roles. Mexico, let's see, where was Mexico at during World War II? Did they jump into it right away? No, I already told you that one. They didn't jump into it until May of 1942, when they declared war on Germany. So this was after the United States was involved, but not that long after. And it was because of the German U-boat attacks against Mexican ships that were providing supplies to the British, and by that time the United States. So was Mexico easily persuaded to go into the war against the United States? No, and that didn't even work in World War I. So there was no consideration there. Now this was interesting because Mexico, as you recall, had just come out of the Mexican Revolution and the final reform positions where the Mexican government nationalized the oil industry, the mineral industry, and so forth. So here you've got the president, Manuel Camacho, and he is very, as long with the Mexican people, he served from 1940, by the way, to 1946. And when the United States, when Mexico ultimately did declare war, its cooperation with the United States was very, very close. And there was actually not just lots of mineral supplies and so forth that came into the war, but there were also military units. Oh, and I have to mention this one as well. The United States, as part of the war effort, helped develop Mexico's economy, helped to invest in factory building in Mexico, so that war resources could be put to work. But there was an interesting thing that Mexico also did for the United States during World War II. We were short of men to work in the fields, in the agricultural fields. We were very short. And so we implored Mexico to the extent that there were people, and there were, to come across the border and help us to harvest our crops. And so that was a very important relationship that was taking place during World War II, to make sure that food could be grown to provide for the people. There was a military unit. Here we go. The Aztec Eagles. Write this down. The Aztec Eagles served in the war. They were also known as the 201st Air Fighter Squadron, and they served alongside the United States, operating out of the Philippines after we liberated the Philippines in 1945. So here we go, Mexicans playing a key role in participating in World War II along with the United States of America. Okay, all right, let's turn our attention to Brazil. All right, now Brazil is a very interesting one. They also started the war independent, neutral, excuse me. We get to Vargas. I think we got Vargas back here. And there's President Roosevelt visiting him at that one time. They stayed out of the war. Ultimately, they did, were trading lots with the British and then ultimately the Americans. And things got really heated, though. In 1942, Brazil broke relations with the Axis powers, Germany and Italy. German U-boats were sinking in the early part of 1942, January to July 1942. 13 Brazilian ships sunk. Another 5 more were sunk in the month of August. Eventually, the Brazilian ship loss was 36 total. And surprise, surprise, by August 22nd, 1942, the Brazilians declared war on Germany and Italy. Getulio Vargas was in charge. Now, this was a bit of a surprise, I suppose some people thought, because this is one of those sort of fascist regimes that was located in Latin America. And there were a fair number of Brazilian immigrants, descendants of Brazilian immigrants as well. But nevertheless, Brazil came in on the side of the Allies and participated, mostly naval operations, helping to sink 9 U-boats along the Brazilian coast, providing some escort services across the of the Atlantic Ocean to make sure that ships did not get sink. They provided rubber. That was a critical natural resource that previously a lot of the world's rubber sources came from Southeast Asia, and of course the Japanese got control of that, so that didn't work out so well. So Brazil provided a lot of rubber for all of the equipment, tires, and all kinds of different airplane parts and so forth that were needed for the war effort. Did they have a military unit? Yes, yes, they did. Here we go. The 1st Division. It is the 1st Division, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, and they fought in the war. And they heard some criticism. In fact, some of the critics were saying that these Brazilian soldiers were not really that critical. They weren't that important. And in fact, this was said about the Brazilian forces. It was more likely for a snake to smoke a pipe than for the Brazilian Expeditionary Force to go to the front of the battle to fight. Yeah. As it turns out, the Brazilians are like, whatever. You can make fun of us. And you know what? We're going to take that insults and we're going to put it into a patch on our uniforms. The snake with a pipe smoking the cobras fumantes. That's what they call themselves, the smoking snakes. They did fight. They were involved in the Allied effort in Italy, which was tough fighting, as well as other areas. And ultimately, they were on the winning side. So thank you, Brazil. Okay. Let's turn our attention now to the next bullet point. I've actually mentioned these already. And this is the overall point: social impact of World War II on the African Americans, Native Americans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Let's get right into it. What we have here are African Americans fighting in the war. And they did play a very, very critical role fighting in the war. Let's just double checking something here. Yeah. Yep. Let's do that one. Sorry. Yes, this is the Tuskegee Airmen led by Benjamin O. Davis, right there. He's portrayed in the film. I think the same guy that was in the Marvel movie with Iron Man and so forth portrayed the commander there. And they ended up fighting very successfully in the war effort in mostly Europe. okay? Even though, of course, as I mentioned, make sure you write this down, the African Americans were kept in segregated units throughout their effort during World War II. It wasn't until July of 1948 that President Harry Truman desegregated the military. Make sure you have that one down. And in part desegregated because of the efforts of African Americans proving themselves as very, very loyal and effective fighters. One of those was, you need to write his name down too as well, Doris Miller, sometimes called Dory Miller. He was a mess attendant serving on a ship, a naval vessel in Pearl Harbor. And during the fight, the Japanese fight, he grabbed hold of an anti-aircraft gun on deck and proceeded to shoot down Japanese aircraft at Pearl Harbor and received the Navy Cross as a result of his efforts in that as well. During the Battle of the Bulge, General Eisenhower saw that our forces were in a very difficult situation. The Germans did a counterattack in the winter of 1944, December 1944, and African American support troops were pushed up to the front to join into the combat because there was such a shortage of replacements. And yeah, I mean, it's like, yeah. The Civil War, for example, would not have been won by the North, by the Union, if it hadn't been for African American units in that war effort. And yeah, and so here we have another example. Yeah, I wanted to make just a brief mention of this as well. I think this can plug in here. Yeah, let's go to the next topic. The Navajo. We have Native Americans in the United States of America. 25,000 Native Americans serve in the United States military, and not in separate segregated units like African Americans, but they were integrated into the regular units of the United States military. Many of these Native Americans left reservations and after the war didn't actually return to them. Very, very loyal, fighting for the American cause. And as some of you guys remember before, you can put this in your notes if you don't have it already, Navajo soldiers from the reservations in Southwest United States, they had a specialized role in the United States military in the Pacific, serving in communication. They are called the code talkers. They would relay messages between various different commands, translating them from English into the Navajo language, sending the message over the airwaves. And yeah, I mean, if the Japanese picked it up, they're like, well, this sounds really strange. Anybody have the cipher to figure out what Navajo language means? Nope. So they were very, very effective. Okay. Women in the military. Women were not serving in combat roles. They were in non-combat roles. Very, very critical in non-combat roles. 60,000 Army nurses, 14,000 Navy nurses, and of course, working in the factories. There's the original Rosie the Riveter. That's the many years later. If you've seen this iconic picture, We Can Do It. The women were encouraged to go into the factories, needed to work. 475,000 working in aircraft factories and other kinds of factories. That's where you get the Rosie the Riveter. Yeah, we can do it. And very, very critical to the American war effort. Okay, oh, before we go to that, to the treatment of the Japanese Americans, let me say a couple of other things. Conscription, let me just say this, conscription, the draft. Were men drafted into the military? Yes, indeed. Between the years, we did have conscription. We had a draft between 1940 and 1973. 50 million registered. Oh, excuse me, the draft existed up until 1973, and then it was done away with, and we've got an all volunteer military ever since then. During the World War II, we had 50 million who were registered, and 10 million who actually were drafted and inducted. Many others volunteered into the United States military. And oh, here's a number I forgot to share with you. 125,000 African Americans serve in the United States military. Sorry about that. You can plug that back into your notes on African Americans. 125,000 African American men serving their country. Okay, let's talk about some other people that live in the United States of America. Yeah, Japanese Americans. Okay, let's talk about this one. Yeah, there's the bullet point. Third bullet point from the bottom. Treatment of Japanese Americans and Canadian Americans. All right, here we go. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, there was concern that a number of different concerns that rose up very quickly among the American population. And that was, oh my gosh, the Japanese, you know, terrible, terrible things. And can we trust people who were of Japanese heritage in our own country? Were they acting as spies? Did they help? Actually, we're an open country, and there were Japanese spies that came around in Hawaii in particular. There's a fair percentage of people living in Hawaii who have Japanese heritage. So it was very easy for Japanese spies to go moving around ahead of time to reconnoiter and find out where all the various different things were and so forth. But yeah, as far as the West Coast, yeah, we freaked out. A president, governors, particularly on the West Coast, were like, oh no, the Japanese are going to attack the West Coast and Japanese Americans can't be relied upon to be loyal. So what happened? The president issued an executive order, 9066. And you can see right there, if you were Japanese American and you lived in California, Oregon, Washington, and the western parts of, or it looks like Arizona, you had to move. There were 110,000 Japanese Americans who had to move. Out of the 127,000 Japanese Americans living in the entire United States, most of them concentrated in the West, they had to move. And they weren't necessarily like told, well, you just got to move. No, you're going to be interned. You're going to be sent to, oh my gosh, whoops. You're going to be sent to a internment camp. Curious thing though, there were about 150,000 Japanese American living in Hawaii. And I mean, a significant portion of the population. Practically, perhaps, the internment order did not apply to them. I think there were only, what, about 1,800 Japanese Americans in Hawaii that were interned. But if you were Japanese American you were living in Seattle or Los Angeles or Portland, yeah, you had to sell your property at bargain basement prices and pack your bags, and you got moved, right? Japanese American disloyalty, waiting for the emperor's command to attack the United States. Really? Yeah, there's a little Star Wars reference for you. It was 66 there instead of what, 9066. I wonder if George Lucas had something on there. In any event, you want to see the really dangerous Japanese Americans that were sent to places like Idaho. Yeah, here are the locations. So you have this exclusion area along the coast, and there are some of the larger camps, internment camps. Look, there's one right not too far from Twin Falls, where you had the peak population over 9,000. If you go to Minidoka, you can't really see too much there now. I think they have a commemoration site, but the ragtag, flimsy buildings that were used to house people are pretty much all deteriorated. So, but while they were in existence, yeah, people were in confinement. Couldn't go too many places. That's what they look like. Yeah, here we go. Here's Minidoka. Well, those are the barracks. Welcome to Idaho. So you live there with your family. Do they have school? Oh yeah, they had school. Oh, they're all excited. This is, except for her, she doesn't look too excited. But these are Japanese Americans in the Minidoka camp. Girls attending school. Yeah, putting the best face on everything. Definitely a massive prejudice as a result of this. So if you were a Japanese American young man and could you get drafted into the United States military? Yeah, you could. And you pretty much had to, otherwise you'd be sent to jail. As it turns out, Japanese American men were like, you know, we're actually very loyal to our country, and we're going to prove it. Enough of this racist prejudice nonsense. So there was a unit put together, and you need to make sure you have this in your notes. This is the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. There you go. These are Japanese Americans, loyal Americans, many of whom were born in the United States of America. They just have Japanese heritage. And they were sent to go fight for the Allied efforts, part of the United States military, in the European theater. And they fought. And they fought here, they fought there, they were fighting in Italy, they were fighting all over the place. And very, very tenacious, gained a reputation for their tenacity, and were the most highly decorated unit in World War II in the United States. Yeah. Fighting which country? United States. Yeah. After the war, we kind of really felt like this was a big mistake. President, Congress eventually apologized. Laws were passed. Funding was created to try to compensate Japanese Americans for the time of detention, and also for the loss of value on all those properties that were, and homes that were forced to be sold. So yeah, let's hope we don't go through that again. What about in Canada? Did they have a similar situation? Because there were a lot of Japanese who had moved to Canada during about the same time that a lot of Japanese were coming to the west coast of the United States. And as it turns out, yep, they were also put into an internment. They were seen as a threat. 1,200 Japanese Canadian 1,200 Japanese Canadian fishing boats were seized by the Canadian government. I guess they were afraid that they were going to be used in cooperation with the Japanese Navy in some kind of an assault. And within 100 miles of the coast, that whole area was removed of Japanese Canadians, about 22,000 altogether, and they were put into internment, their property sold. So it's a very similar situation to what occurred in the United States of America. Next bullet point. Reaction to the Holocaust in the Americas. This is a very interesting situation here. Jews were not being treated very well in Nazi Germany. Yeah, that was probably the low point. And there were times in Europe as well that Jews were like, yeah, this is not a very, very cool place to live. A number of them had moved to the United States of America over the years in American history, and we had concentrations of Jewish population. You can see in the New York area, in New Jersey, and so forth in New England, there were a significant number of Jews that had lived there, but they also felt the effects of anti-Jewish prejudices in the United States. And you can even look, right? I mean, this is what, 2000? And you don't see lots of Jews finding their way into certain parts of the country. In the 1920s, the United States had very restrictive immigration laws and quotas, 1921 and 1924. And even after the 1929 stock market crash, well, this sounds familiar, when things were really bad after the economy, like really tanked in 1929, all kinds of immigration restrictions were put up because it just didn't want to have too many people coming over the United States going after those scarce jobs. As it turns out, actually, there wasn't as many that were interested in coming over. But as you recall, if you were a German Jew, would you be interested perhaps in coming to the United States in the 1930s? I mean, is there anything taking place in the 1930s besides the Great Depression that might lead you to want to maybe come over to the United States to get away from Germany, from Austria? Yeah. In fact, here is a boat. This was 1939. This was before World War II officially started. German Jews, having gone through Kristallnacht and really, really in the Nuremberg laws and all kinds of anti-Jewish persecution by the Nazis, many of them found their way onto boats. This boat in particular, the MS St. Louis, and they tried to immigrate from Germany to the United States of America. And they arrived in the United States of America, and here they are in port. I'm going to say New York or so forth. And we're like, no, they didn't have a virus. They were just not wanted in the United States of America. I was like, seriously? We're going to turn this boat and send it back to Germany? That's exactly what happened. And if you follow up on the lives of many of the people who were on the boat, most, if not all, ended up in concentration camps. This was really, really sad testament to what was going on in the late 1930s. Even as Jews were trying to get out of Germany, they couldn't necessarily make their way to the United States of America. Although there was, I don't know if I told you, a story about a grandparents. There were two older people in the city of Vienna, Austria, which had been taken over by Germany. And their grandson, they arranged to have stay with family in New York City. And they were able to get him out because there were Jews in America, American citizens, who were able to support and basically adopt this young man. And ultimately, he grew up, got married to my dad's sister, and grew up and raised a family in Idaho Falls, Idaho. 6 kids. Very cool. After the war, 1948, we'll talk about this a little bit more. British occupied Palestine. Remember the mandate after World War I, where the Turkish territory in the Middle East had been divided up between the British and the French to sort of look after as mandates by the League of Nations. Well, by 1948, the British were like, yeah, we don't want to be in charge of Palestine anymore. And there were a lot of Jews that had moved to that area, and they were like, can we be a country? Will you allow us to be a country? And the new international organization, which we'll be talking about, the United Nations, they voted yes. There it is, 1948. Jewish majority population, a country known as Israel. And everything works out fine from that point on. No. One of the things we'll talk about during the Cold War is a lot of the fights that go on relative to Jews and their Arab neighbors. And yeah. But nevertheless, there was an opportunity for Jews who survived the Holocaust to find a new home. You could go to the United States. Many of them, though, went to Israel. Another key thing, let me see, impact of technological developments in the beginning of the atomic age. What happened there? Yes, a bomb was created, Manhattan Project. Obviously, for military purposes, the nuclear abilities were used to create massive explosive bombs, which helped to bring World War II to a perhaps quicker conclusion. But were there any peaceful uses? Anybody know? There were. And in fact, you can write this down, December 20th, 1951, the very first peaceful use of atomic power. Anybody know where it was? Right near Arco, Idaho. In the desert. EBR-1, the world's first nuclear power plant. The Idaho National Laboratory is out in that part. I don't know if you guys have ever been out there near Craters of the Moon. There's a facility, and that's where the very first nuclear power plant was created. So that was very, very cool. We're going to be talking more about nuclear energy and particularly weapons aspects as we go into our next unit in the Cold War. If you look at the next thing, we've got effects and results of the war. There's a little bit more there. I think what we're going to do is we're going to wrap this up for this video, and then our next video we will have, it'll be, I don't know, it'll be fairly short. We'll do the last part of that on page 2, effects and results of the war, and then I'll give you an assessment. So we'll talk more about that. All right, you guys be safe.